Other than that, today we are going to hear from Doctors Michael Searcy and Marion Forrest. So just to briefly introduce, in case you don't know much about them, sometimes it strikes me how little our students know about our own faculty. But Dr. Mike Searcy did his PhD in anthropology in 2010, received it in 2010 from the University of Oklahoma. Prior to that, he'd done a master's in anthropology here at BYU. That's when Mike and I first met. And he had done a bachelor's in journalism in University of North Texas prior to that. He's the director of the New World Archaeological Foundation here at BYU, and currently an associate professor in our department. He was, prior to that, a staff archaeologist at the Office of Public Archaeology here at BYU as well. He has a book in the works entitled Nothing is New, Renaissance and Structural Transformation, Renaissance. We'll let you tell us about that, Mike.
Yeah, you're using the French. You're using the French, and nothing against French, but I use the English version of the word.
Oh, got you.
Renaissance, yes.
And as well as the 2011 book, The Life-Giving Stone, Ethnoarchaeology of Maya Metates. And Dr. Marion Forrest received her PhD in archaeology from the University of Paris 1 Pantheon-Sorbonne. She's currently a postdoctoral research associate in our department. She also served as a Thyssen Research Foundation Fellow at Arizona State University. And her work specializes in ancient urbanism and urbanization processes in Western and Central Mexico. And she's published a number of articles on these and other topics. So with that very brief introduction to Dr. Searcy and Dr. Forrest, if you'd all join me in welcoming them, and we'll turn the time over to both of you.
Okay, we've got like multiple screens here, but it's really great. So I think at any given time we know what's up. But yeah, so we're really excited to share about the work that we did last year in Mexico, much of which is stemming from a long-term project that I've been doing in northern Mexico. And so we're just going to give you kind of an overview of what we found last year and how it ties into my project goals, specifically trying to understand more about what we call the Casas Grandes people. Casas Grandes is a region in northwest Mexico, or at least what we classify as an archaeological culture, right? And it encompasses about this much of the area. I think you're seeing this there, right? This much area in that northwest portion of Chihuahua. It spreads a little over into the Boot Hill of New Mexico, as well as along the Sierra Madre Occidental on the eastern border of Sonora as well. And this culture lasted anywhere from, I'd say like 700 AD. These are new dates are showing about somewhere between 600 and 700 AD to about 1450 AD. We don't know of any known modern day descendants of the people of Casas Grandes, but it's interesting. There's kind of this middle period that we know a ton about. And then on the bookends of the archaeological culture of Casas Grandes, we don't know much about. And so my goal as of late has been to study that earlier part. It stems from trying to figure out what in the world happened somewhere between the 12th and 13th century AD when the people of Casas Grandes built the city of Paquine, known as probably one of the largest city centers in all of the US Southwest and Northwest Mexico in all of prehistory. And just to show you what Paquine looks like from above, this is an aerial view of the apartment buildings in this city center, many of which have not been excavated, as well as Mesoamerican style ball courts. These are the furthest north that you find these ball courts outside of central and southern Mexico and in parts of northern Central America. Platform mounds, cisterns that held massive amounts of water, gallons and gallons of water to supply water for the people of Paquine. There were interesting features like this mound of the cross that was cardinally aligned. I think it personally was some kind of solar observatory that was a cylindrical system for the people of Paquine, as well as massive pit ovens, which will come up later. These ovens were used for roasting large amounts of food, likely agave hearts and probably corn, possibly for making alcoholic beverages for feasting. And so it was a really unique site, not only because of its size, but because of its difference from other sites in the region. And so, again, we know a lot about this time period, which is about 1200, excuse me, yes, 1200 to about 1450 AD. And what we know is that the city popped up in the desert. What we don't know is why it popped up. And so my goal has been to try to understand what I call the roots of Casas Grandes. Here's an actual, an aerial photo of that same site taken from the eye of one of our drones. Scott Ure and I went and flew this site so that we could create a newer and more updated map of the city itself. This is also in preparation, hopefully in the near future, to go and excavate at this site once again. The last time it was excavated was, I think, 1961. And so a lot of work was done there. It was like 3 full years of excavation, but since that time, nobody's worked there. And so the idea is to try to get back to this site. But first, I wanted to know more about what caused the people in this region to build this city sometime in the 1200s to 1300s. So our project is called The Roots of Casas Grandes, and our main goals are to refine the chronology and to understand a little bit more about the people that lived in the period that's known as the Viejo period. In Spanish, that just means old. Medio period means middle. Real creative names for these time periods, right? It's the old, the middle, and the late period. So focusing on this early period, we really wanted to know a little bit more about the chronology. There literally had been maybe 13 sites that were either tested or somewhat excavated. Only 2 had been either very extensively excavated or fully excavated. So literally only 2 sites have really been explored in any detail. So the first thing we needed to do was find out where some of these Viejo period sites were. So starting in 2013, my colleague Todd Peitzel at the University of Arizona and I began this Roots of Casas Grandes project to try to find the sites, and then we started excavating as well. 2015 was our first excavation at a site, and then last year was continuation of another site that we found during the survey. I've also been engaging in a ton of material studies, which include a reanalysis of the ceramics from that time period to try to get a better idea of how they evolved over time and how people changed this technically it was an art, right? This craft of creating very beautiful painted and plainware pottery that they use daily in their lives. We don't know much about it and how it evolved, and so that's something I've been working on. One of our students here, Dan King, who's a graduate student now, graduated, but he and I did a study on dental calculus. We actually scraped the teeth of people from the Viejo period as well as from the Medio period of their tartar. I know that sounds kind of gross, but interestingly, within that tartar, you can find really cool stuff. We found evidence of what they ate probably 2 to 3 months before they died, the people that we scraped, including evidence of corn and probably corn beer, which I think is probably the first evidence of corn beer on a human being, at least from that time period and in this area. But we were able to make comparisons between the Viejo period and Medio period. And I'm currently working on a very large ancient DNA study with my colleague Meredith Snow at the University of Montana, where we're looking at around 400 burials of the 500 plus that were found at Paquine and the 3 other sites that were excavated back in the 50s and 60s. And so currently the DNA is being sequenced, so we can try to get an idea of who the people were before Casas Grandes, before Paquine, the city, popped up, and if perhaps the city arose due to large migrations. And so those are our main questions that we have, and these are some of my project goals. Also, I should mention that one of our more recent students, Jaron Davidson, who is now at the University of Oklahoma working on his PhD, also was looking at long distance exchange. In other words, how items, especially from West Mexico, made their way into the city of Paquine, but especially during the Viejo period. So what am I planning to do? Well, we need to complete the ADNA analysis and finally planning to rediscover and further explore Viejo components that actually lie below the city of Paquine. There was a Viejo village that was right beneath one of the components of that large site. And so my goal is to go back and re-excavate eventually and try to refine that chronology just a little bit more so that we can say more about how this city evolved over time. And it's a classic example of would say, complexity, the rise of complexity in an area where otherwise it was pretty low scale. For example, at the San Diego site, which we excavated last year, this is considered a Viejo period hamlet, or probably like a little family occupied site where they likely were farming in the river valley right down below where the site was. And Dr. Forrest is going to be talking mostly about what we found at the site, but just briefly, I wanted to point out that the three main things that we were able to accomplish is we found one of the largest structures that dates to this period. I put 10 meters, probably more roughly like 7.5. Yeah, so if you count the exterior of the walls and things like that, it's a pretty big structure. And it was likely communal, built by this community to gather for whether it be ceremonies or just family gatherings, feasting, things like that. We found a roasting pit that was very similar to the ones that we found or that we do find during the Medio period, this later period. And it's the first one that we know of that predates those later on. Now it's on a smaller scale, but it was really cool to find it and realize that there was some continuity from this Viejo period to the Middle period. And then we did a bunch of test pits trying to find structures, other structures that might be out there. And we found at least one other floor that's probably of a small house that we want to go back and excavate in the future. So I'm going to back off gracefully as Dr. Forrest scoots up and talks more about the San Diego site and what we accomplished there last year.
Look at this beautiful chair valley. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about the San Diego site. So an earlier site located, so it's called San Diego because it's located close to a colonial hacienda. So that's definitely not decolonizing archaeology here. Just call the site the name of the hacienda. It's a site that was detected in 2013 during the survey conducted by Dr. Searcy. So it was already kind of something on the map that needed to be excavated in more detail and not just detected based on surface material. The site is located close to a river, which is of course a pretty nice place to build a site. It's right on the little low, like a low hilltop. And it's this interesting landscape that was surveyed systematically with a number of different artifact scatters found on the surface, so ceramics and lithics and a different type of tools that were present on the surface and indicate the presence of a pre-Hispanic settlement. But the first objects found just right on the surface, and I can show you the surface here, seemed to indicate in 2013 the presence of this Viejo period type of site. So that's why Dr. Searcy decided to target the site for the 2019 field season to try to not only observe things just from the surface, but try to understand a little bit how those settlements were organized and what type of structure we could find there, find if it was a small village, the type of material culture we could find, and of course, and it's going to be kind of the latest part of this presentation, what kind of datation, what kind of date we could get from this site, and what does it mean in terms of change in settlement pattern at the region. So the first limit of the sites were established in 2013 based on the artifacts and surface. However, of course, for an excavation, we cannot explore the entire site, especially when it's just scatter of material on the surface. We have to decide on the strategy to detect interesting context, which is complicated in this type of context where there is no architecture that can be seen on the surface, right? There's like just pieces of archaeological artifacts on the top of the site, like on the surface, but not a lot of stone concentration or piece of walls that can be an indication of buildings, for example, which is something we will be interested in. So it was kind of a interesting strategy, kind of little investigation to find spots that would be interesting for us to excavate in a more intensive, extensive, and horizontal way. Most of the operation conducted happened in that area of the site, so the central area of the site, in different locations. And you can see here on the little map, you have different, like the larger black surface are locations that have been extensively excavated versus trench, like smaller operation trenches and just test pit and test trenches that are located here to see if there's something under the ground. So this is another map of the area we investigate a little bit closer. So you can see all the different operations that have been conducted in 2019. So we excavated from May 1st to June 7th. So I think it was 7 weeks, 6 weeks, 6 full-time weeks of excavation. So we had time to do a lot of different things. However, one big discovery actually took most of our time, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So one of the things we use to find interesting things when there's nothing above ground is generally looter pits. Why? Because looters, they know where to find things. And so they will leave some kind of prints behind them that can be actually of use for us, even if generally it's a little sad to see what they did with this part of the context. So in the case of that structure, it started with a looter pit. And with this kind of pit, this kind of hole that we find, and we're like, let's open a little bit this area and see if actually those looters were like found something, hit something. And so this area was trenched on I think it was 11 meters. So it started smaller and then we extended. And we actually found, while digging this test trench, big one, the surface of a floor. So of course it's not, tile floor. It's going to be a compacted surface made out of clay, made out of dirt that have been compacted, and in this case that have been burnt. So the conservation of that compacted surface of dirt will be better because it has burned during a big fire. One of the other evidence we have was to find those little pieces of burnt wood on top of that floor surface. So we found and we excavated in this trench to find the surface of this floor approximately on 7 meters, which indicates a very large structure because even if it's a 7 meter over a couple of meters wide, it's going to be a large surface. So then most of the excavation season was dedicated to follow that floor, to follow that surface occupied by the inhabitants of San Diego during this pre-Hispanic time, probably the Viejo period. And so it was this big work of expanding the trench until we got this very large surface of excavation. I'm going to show you the final state of it. So this it's not 7.5, it's 11 meters. Yeah, it's 11 meters, sorry, it's from here. So this very large structure, it took us a lot of energy to actually move all that dirt to open such a wide surface of excavation. But this is how far this floor surface led us, actually. So you can see everybody was kind of like on deck to excavate that. We still have our shoes here, but generally we're excavating in socks to not break that very fragile surface of floor. And we extended the excavation as far as we could in the time that we had. You can see here, Scott is actually making the nice drone picture of that giant structure. We could have never get, a normal picture and get the whole thing. So I'm not going to go into detail the excavation itself, but since we found a lot of things on top of that floor surface, there was a very strict and thorough recording of things through picture, of course, and through drawing, technical drawing at scale. And here I can show you kind of the final results of that beautiful recording of things and a couple of features that we find while excavating and clearing that floor that say a little bit about the function and the architecture of that structure. So for example, we have a hearth, pretty small for that big of a building. And we find a couple of indications of architecture system and construction, which is very interesting because this technological aspect of how we build things will be an interesting way to compare this site with other sites of the region and this sites with sites that were built further on in time, including Pakistani. So here we have a circular building of like more than 10 meters of diameter that was, which walls were built with a series of posts. So you can see here on this lower image, this series, right? There you go. So you have all the series of posts that were aligned and formed the circle. We'll still have a couple of those beams preserved because it was preserved by the big fire that destroyed this structure and burned this floor. So we could find it actually in that beautiful state. Other indication that we can find about how this building was built. So we have the posts, the beam, and we also have the clay, like the dirt that was used to build the wall of that structure. So it was a series of posts that were covered by clay, by different types of wall plaster made out of dirt mixed with a couple of things, and generally structure on different series of bedroll. So we know that they were using the posts, they were using other type of plants and little reeds to actually build the walls of that structure. There's also probably mark of some traces of ropes. And finally, you can see in here, it's always kind of a nice thing for archaeologists when we connect with the people who built this building, right? When we found those nice little fingerprints and handprints on the walls that show how people plastered those pieces of clay on top of that or against the post. So those kind of findings that were also preserved because it was fired, because the fire preserved those pieces of clay or dirt as it would make ceramics, right? It just fire them, so they are very well preserved. That was a very interesting type of evidence for us to understand how this big structure was built. Finally, and that was kind of the last but not least, it always happened the last week of excavation, the big findings. So most of the cases burials, but here it was this huge posts that didn't completely burn and that took forever to be dug out. You can see here, so I have like a million of those step-by-step picture of the whole team working around this wood piece. It's very rare to find wood that is not burned in that kind of state. So it was a very amazing discovery, and we took that out very carefully until we cleaned it up. In the lab, you can see the large piece of wood. One of the big hope about it was tree ring dating. Unfortunately, the outer ring of this post of this beam was missing, and no tree ring dating was possible. So I was quite disappointed, but still, it's a great discovery. Just for the fun, while everybody was having fun digging out this beautiful post, I was trying to find one in another postal, however, without success, but it was there at some point. I was completely buried in that postal, but that's okay. And finally, to kind of give you an idea of what we're looking at, and here it's a reconstruction for the 1960s work by DePeso, so the person who did most of the Pakistani site and also found another of those big houses in another site. You can see a little bit how it would have looked maybe. It's a position, was a lot of reconstruction. So kind of a big round houses. With this size and comparison with the other site, it has to be at least a gathering, a large familiar, or even a community house. So we actually find the community house at the village, probably not any other houses, but probably the heart of the village in terms of building and kind of social spatial center. So those buildings are very rare in the archaeological record at the region. So only a couple of other cases have been excavated. And Journey has excavated with techniques that does not allow to do a lot of to draw a lot of interpretation, especially in this case, which was kind of an early case. Nothing was screened. The kind of modern method of archaeology we're using today were not applied there. So the excavation of the house we found at San Diego is definitely a plus in the research at the region. I have another cases here to show you. I'm going to go very fast because I have no idea. Okay. Okay. So this large house, this community house, took us a lot of time, a lot of energy, but it was not all. In the meantime, other things were happening at the site. Couple of like different members of the team were kind of like working on different things, on test trenches. And in this second area of excavation, that was also detected, kind of like located because of interesting material found in surface. So we thought, okay, there might be something here. And we started to excavate this area, excavation area too. Sorry, I'm not sorry in Spanish. Spanish. So the second area was at first kind of confusing. Lots of different stones, a lot of stone that seemed to have been cracked by fire. Pieces that seems to be ground stone, so part of the equipment for cooking and processing the food, but everything in a pretty random area, like a random pattern. So it was a little confusing at first, but then we extended the excavation and of course went deeper very carefully. And we found this very interesting context, this roasting pit or oven, this subterranean structure completely walled with stone made to cook things or actually to create fire in a safe environment. So different phase of excavation allowed us to completely excavate and to completely empty this very interesting pit. Not a lot of actually artifacts and stuff had been found, which explain also, which show that probably those structures, the roasting pit, but also the big community structure had been systematically abandoned and cleaned before they were abandoned, and in the case of the house, completely fired and burned down. But here we have a structure that is an interesting asset in the life of the village. So it can be something used on a daily basis. It can be a roasting pit that is used for specific events or ritual event for gatherings. We don't really know what was the intensity of use of this structure because we don't have a lot of material associated. We don't have a lot of phono bones, for example, to show us what they were cooking in there, or botanical remain, or the type of archaeological artifacts and artifacts that could say a little bit about the use of this thing. But one thing, it was deep, as you can see, Sylvie is deeply committed to the excavation of this thing. She was almost disappearing at the end. So an interesting structure, and as Dr. Searcy said before, no other structure of this kind is known for that time period. But since it's known for a later period, it kind of gives us a first glimpse about some kind of continuity that could exist between the people using the test pit, the roasting pit at that time, and the people also using the same time of structure of pit and oven in the later period. So those were the two big findings of the excavation in 2019. Very interesting in many reasons because they were not the first in the two kinds, but example of very rare type of finding for the region and for that time period, and like therefore a lot like a source of information. Very interesting for us, especially as we very carefully excavated that to try to gather as many data as we can, as much data as we can. It's still a very small sample at those the scale of the site, so many other components of that site needs to be detected, needs to be excavated. We have the community house, but where are the other houses? Where are the other people? What were exactly their way of life? So we have some information, but there's still a lot to do. What is very interesting too is the systematic cleaning and abandonment of those structures. So the people who lived in that village at some point decided to close those structures, to clean them very carefully, which is not good for archaeology. Archaeologists would like when people are just leaving their stuff behind them and we need trash. In this case, we don't have a lot. They cleaned everything. And then in the case of the big community structure, they burned it down. And this is the way we found it. So what does that mean about the different life at the sites in the moment those people decided to leave? So here, the chronology of events will be very interesting because we need to know when they left and why they left. And if this abandonment has some kind of link with the change of settlement pattern and the reorganization of people across the landscape in that region. And here you go. All right.
So that brings us to the dating of this site. And again, this being one of the project goals for the Roots of Casas Grandes project in general, the excavation of new sites, of course, gives you the chance to find organic remains that can be radiocarbon dated. Of course, it would be great if we had ceramic seriation for this time period, but we don't. We have this like 500-year time span, which we know so little about. So going back to what I discussed earlier about what we do know about Casas Grandes region, it's that it's about a 150-year time period that we know most about. Paquimé itself, the big city, and sites roundabout have been excavated. Not very many, but enough to where we can solidly place the Medio period somewhere between about 1150 and 1450 AD. We more safely put it somewhere in 1200 AD. But we really have no, and up until the work that I've been doing and others further south from where we're working, we had no idea what was going on 500 years before this city was built. And so once again, the idea is to get a better grasp on that time period. Now, originally, Charles de Peso, who had done the excavations that Dr. Forrest talked about, and that I talked about back in the 50s and 60s, he divided the Viejo period into these three phases. Unfortunately, the middle phase is just based on architectural differences at one site that he dug. So he fully excavated a site called the Convento site. And he thought that he saw changes in how they built these pit houses where they would dig down into the ground and then within that pit would build their house. That's why, like Dr. Forrest said, after these things collapsed, they're really hard to see on the surface because other soil covers it up. And literally the only indication that you might have that there is a pit house or any kind of structure below the surface is if artifacts get pulled up to the surface, either by erosion or by turbation, say, for example, by animals, right, digging the stuff up or pulling it out, or looters, of course, as Dr. Forrest mentioned, often give us an indication where these things are. At the site of San Diego, we were able to collect several pieces of organic remains, and specifically those that preserve best are those that have been carbonized or burned. The dates that we had before this site and this project were literally two. So Charles de Peso actually only dated two things. Now, granted, his excavations were back from 1958 to 1961. And if you're familiar with the history of radiocarbon dating, it had only been really invented and discovered in 1950 when Willard Libby had discovered that you could actually date things based on the decay rate of carbon-14, which is an unstable radioactive isotope. And so de Peso really hadn't put much faith in the radiocarbon dating method and had focused almost solely on tree ring dates. The unfortunate thing about that is that with all the posts and beams that were used to build the site of Paquimé, where he got the majority of his dates from, had the outer rings removed, just like the one that Dr. Forrest presented that we excavated out of the site at San Diego. They were likely scraped. As you can imagine, oftentimes bugs live in the bark of trees. And so I'm sure that probably had something to do with it. Maybe they wanted to smooth them down to the smooth surface. But when you remove the outer rings of these trees, you can't get what's called a cutting date. And for the majority of the tree rings that were analyzed for this original study, those outer rings were removed. So Charles de Peso's chronology was like, anywhere from 50 to 100 years off, as we see it now using radiocarbon dates. And we're only just now starting to refine the chronology. And it's been worked on kind of sporadically since the 1980s. People have been saying, we think Charles de Peso was a little wrong. Well, in the case of the Viejo, he literally only sampled two things for the radiocarbon dates for the Viejo period. One sample was corn. It was later recalibrated to be at a median date of around 8630. And this is from the site of Convento. And then he also had another date from some corn and some charcoal that was mixed. And if you're familiar, I'm not going to go into the details of it, but if you're familiar, there's this issue of old wood, right? You can cut a tree down and burn it, but the inner rings are going to be from a different period than the outer rings, right? So you have wood that can be very, very old and represent a huge range of dates. And so we try to date things that are annual. Items, organic materials that were alive at one time, usually within 1 year, give us a little bit more solid carbon dates. So there was this not only lack of dates, but the flaws in the possible contaminations, like this corn being mixed with charcoal, corn being mixed with wood. Now, what's great is that other archaeologists, including Jane Kelly and her crew, worked in what's known as the southern zone. So this is an area farther south than where Dr. Forrester and I were working, and it's considered to be kind of like a different enclave of the Casas Grandes people. We're still trying to make connections between these two areas, and a lot less work has been done down in the south. But it includes the collection and analysis of over 30 dates. For the Viejo period, they span between 1800 and about 1250 AD. And most of these are from small wood or maize or corn samples, so that's good. We can really see these as comparable dates as they come from these annuals, or at least small samples that should yield good dates. And just to indicate again, this blue circled area is where we were working in what's considered the northern zone, and these other dates came from the southern zone. So once again, the southern zone, we have about 30 dates. Up here in the northern zone, we literally only had two radiocarbon dates and no dendrochronology or tree ring dates. So the project that we've been working on has been, in fact, working to amplify our dating for this earlier period and to refine it. So these new dates that we've gotten included those that came from the results of our surveys that found sites, and two of these sites were excavated, including Vista del Valle in 2015, and of course San Diego last year. We were able to extract 13 dates. And then I have also, in my DNA analysis, have just recently got permission to submit portions. So we take premolars and incisors for the DNA analysis, and sometimes parts of the petrous bone. This is from just behind the ear, within the skull. And so we originally were just planning to extract DNA, but we had enough of the samples left over that we could submit them for radiocarbon dating. And so I got a grant last year, and we're able to run some of these dates for both the Convento site, which is a Viejo period site, and at the site of Haquime. So these are the first new dates from this northern zone since the 1950s and 60s. And we're looking to publish these pretty soon after we get them a little more analyzed and look at them in conjunction with some other dates. But we're trying to refine this chronology, and thus have gotten 6 new dates from the Convento site. Just to show you where these sites are that we worked at, Marion was showing you all our work at the San Diego site. These are the other Viejo period sites that we found in our surveys in 2013. Vista del Valle is the other site I'm going to talk about here in just a second regarding radiocarbon dates. Here's a picture of that site. It was heavily looted. It was real close to the town of Monte Ortiz, and people realized that there were a lot of valuable vessels and burials at this site. And so all throughout this kind of red dotted area, it was totally looted, beyond the ability to actually extract any good data. And so we worked here on the perimeter of the looted area and found some really cool structures, 3 of which we excavated in full, although structure 3 here was quite looted. It was within that looted area. And we also found a thermal feature. It was another one of these kind of like rock. It wasn't a rock-lined oven like the one we found at the San Diego site, but it definitely was filled with burned rock. It had animal bone, large amounts of pronghorn antelope, which are endemic and native to this area. And so we were able to get some radiocarbon dates from this site as well. So this is just a collection, a chart showing the different radiocarbon dates from the different sites that I've now extracted dates from, including that of the site that was dug by Peso back in the 1950s and 60s. Just to show you the Vista del Valle site that I just showed you a map of, we had really good dates for the early part of the Viejo period. As a matter of fact, these are the best dates for the earliest part of the Viejo period. Once again, I mentioned we really didn't know when it started, but now we're looking at sometime after around 650 AD. People were in this area. They were building little villages and probably farming corn. We know that they're farming corn because a lot of these dates actually come from corn. And so we got really good solid dates from that site that indicate an occupation sometime between 650 and the late 700s. The site that we dug last year included that big structure that Dr. Forrest talked about. And this may seem like overkill. We got 13 total dates from the site, but we took, of these, we took 9 dates out of that one pit structure. We wanted to be certain that we were getting good dates. And so you can see they all line up really well. The majority of these being either from corn or from small reed fragments, again, indicating that they were from pieces of plants that have been grown within 1 year. So it really tightens up the error on that on these radiocarbon dates. So you can see that the San Diego site is dating a little bit later than the Vista del Valle site, sometime probably during the 900s. And just to point this out, an issue of old wood, we did, because we couldn't get dendrochronology done, we couldn't get tree rings taken from the large post that we found. That was probably one of the large roof support posts of this building. I did pull off a small piece of the outermost ring of that post, and you'll notice that it's a little bit earlier than the dates that we got for the pieces of burned material that we found on the floor of the structure and some in the wall and the fill of the structure. Once again, indicating that in all likelihood, the ring that I was pulling off of the outer part of that tree was probably not the cutting date, right? Those rings that were on the very exterior. So we get a good alignment with these dates and what we found archaeologically. We also, in that pit that Dr. Forrest showed you, we were able to get 4 different dates, one from the surface right next to metate, a grinding stone, from a piece of corn. And that was this date right here, which once again lines up pretty well with the rest of the structure that we excavated at the San Diego site. And then the rest of it was wood. So we get kind of some variable stretches and spans in the dates there. And then finally, bringing in some of the dates from these burials that we've been studying doing ancient DNA. My colleague, Dr. Snow, which I should mention, she's an alumnus of BYU. She got her undergrad here and now is a professor at the University of Montana. If anybody's looking to do genetic studies, especially ancient DNA, they've got a PhD program, and she would be an awesome person to work with. I'd be more than happy to introduce you. She's got a postdoc working for her right now on this project, and is getting some excellent experience in ancient DNA. I know I'm learning a lot. I don't know much about it, but the cool thing is that from these individuals, we were able to take these radiocarbon dates to once again add to those from the Viejo period. So you can see in this example, or in this sample from the Convento site, which was an excavation done by DePeso. It's what we call the type site, right, for that time period. It was the site that he defined the Viejo period with. The dates are a little bit variable, suggesting a little bit longer occupation. People lived there, as DePeso had suspected, anywhere from about 800, 900 AD to the 10 and 1100s. Closer to the time period when there was that transition to where the people in this region started building houses above ground and building the large city center of Paki. The cool thing that came from this was a crazy old date. And I'm pretty certain that it's a solid date. It could be an error, it could be an aberration, but we did get a somewhere in the 500s BC date, around 560 BC is what the median range for that date was, suggesting that perhaps we have some occupation preceding the Viejo period. Now we know that there were larger occupations all the way back in about 1500 BC, in what we know to be the later part of the Archaic period. And these people built their structures and their living quarters up on the sides of mountains by terracing them. A book just came out by John Roney and Robert Hard. They've been excavating and exploring these sites for years. So this date's kind of cool because it actually links up this older time period with what happened with the Casas Grandes period. So we're seeing these distinct periods in which people occupied this area. But obviously the dates from the Viejo period show rather continuous occupation, starting somewhere around 650 AD, moving through to the building of the city of Paki. So what do these dates tell us? It solidifies, first off, the beginning of the Viejo period. We're seeing more solidly with this data that somewhere in the 7th century AD, people moved in, they started farming corn and building these little village hamlets. These new burial dates at the convento let us know that it was probably occupied a little bit later by the Viejo period. And that early date supports what De Peso once said was probably some kind of pre-ceramic period that was after this trinchera phase, this archaic phase, and of course the Viejo period. So it's kind of cool. I mean, the cool thing about this area is that so few people work there. Every little bit that we do brings about like brand new discoveries. So it's super exciting. And we together would like to thank our crew. I would have to say this is one of my favorite crews that I've ever worked with in the field. It includes 7 students of our very own BYU cohort here. You can see all of them here at our favorite restaurant, Rosas, Taqueria Rosas. I'm such a snob. I won't even eat Mexican food in the US because we can get such good food in Mexico. And this is one of our favorites. Here's my colleague, Todd Paito. You can see our colleague, Scott Ure, who helped out so much on this day. Our students visiting a site with Dr. Forrest, including the Y tree that she just pointed out to me. It was so cool. It was serendipity, right? That they knew BYU students were coming to visit. So we'd like to thank all the students and all of our collaborators on this project. And now we open it up to questions. Thanks for the claps, Dr. Hickman.